Lords of the Fallen. Okay, so at the time of filming this video, I have just over 83 hours of playtime. I've done pretty much everything I can do, minus some quests that I royally screwed up, so those will just have to wait till my second playthrough. But having finished all the content this game has to offer, I'm ready to give my thoughts about it. I'll also do my best to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. First up, let's talk about level design. I was pleasantly surprised by the amount of diversity this game has to offer, from castles, swamps, snowy areas, flaming hellscapes, among others. Each area tends to be a pretty linear experience, but there's plenty of little hidden areas to find and explore within each zone, offering some satisfying exploration, but nothing too crazy. They did get creative with where they hide things, making it easy to miss loot, so being thorough is a must here if you're a loot goblin like myself. Even though each area is linear, you can still choose what area you want to progress through, so if I'm struggling through a zone, I can just head over to another area, progress through there instead. The game also doesn't really give you much direction other than go cleanse the beacons, so it's really up to you with how you want to proceed. I really enjoyed that freedom because I was able to push through a very late game area pretty early on. Yeah, it was tough, but the satisfaction was pretty great. With that being said, I do wish they gave the player a little more to go on in some sections. At one point, I had cleansed 4 of the beacons and got a little lost trying to figure out how to get through another door. It was a little frustrating not knowing that I had to finish the 5th beacon in order for that door to open. Something simple when you try to open the door like beacons block the path could have solved that issue for me, but that really only happened once. Other than that, it was simple enough to just look up into the sky, find a beacon, and walk in that direction. You could tell the people who made this game understood the Souls-like formula, but also wanted to sort of shake things up a little bit because we have the one interconnected world with a bunch of shortcuts that we see in other Souls-likes, but we also have to manage the lantern mechanic. Holding up the lantern allows you to peer into the Umbral realm so that you can find hidden things like secret rooms or bridges. It also allows for some very limited interaction with it, like walking across said bridge or going through a hidden door, but that also means monsters in that world can see you and hit you. If that does happen, it will force you into that world fully, so be mindful of your surroundings while holding up that lantern. You can also fully transition over at any time, but while in the Umbral realm, you'll have to deal with a constant stream of monsters on top of the ones you would normally have to fight. And the longer you're in here, the harder it gets, until a red wraith looking dude spawns in to assert its dominance after about 5 minutes or so. To compensate for this increased difficulty, you get an experience multiplier. And I found this to be the best way to farm. After a while, I did find that just holding up the lantern was a bit tedious, and more often than not, I opted to just fully commit to the Umbral realm and deal with the extra monsters. You can also use the lantern to rip the soul out of enemies and throw them off ledges if that's your thing. Overall, I really enjoyed this mechanic. It added some extra depth to the game, and I hope to see it again in the future. Something I found a little surprising, the transition to the Umbral realm happens in real time and somehow manages to not lag out my game. I did lose about 15 to 20 FPS while over there, but at least the transition was very smooth and no stuttering or lagging out. I played through the game on medium to high settings with HDR turned on and ran at a mostly steady 60 to 80 FPS, but had quite a few crashes in the first 2 days. However, I believe a patch has since fixed most, if not all, of the crashing issues. The last thing I want to touch on as far as level design goes is enemy placement. This is where I think they dropped the ball a bit. I felt like around every corner they had put something that's sole purpose was to knock you off a cliff or a large drop. I don't mind the occasional cheesy death, like okay haha you got me, but they way overdid it here. You could be walking across the path and some dude who's completely hidden will pop out from behind those boxes and push you off a cliff. The only way to know it's coming is to die from it and remember he's there on your next attempt. With that taken into consideration, I found the level design to be pretty good, not amazing, just good. Moving on to combat. There are a lot of things to like about the combat in Lords of the Fallen, but I'm gonna get the negatives out of the way. First, when you do a melee swing, your character lunges a little too far forward. A small amount of forward lunge is great. It keeps you in the fight if an enemy is backpedaling or strafing, but I think they overdid it just a little bit here. It's not to the point of being annoying, just an inconvenience, but it still felt like it's worth mentioning. Second, spell diversity, and in some cases, poor balancing. I started my game as the cultist with the intention of going full infernal spellcaster, but I very quickly realized that the game doesn't give you a replenishable mana potion, only consumables that you have to either find or purchase from an NPC, and your mana does not regenerate on its own. Because of this, I played through most of the game using magic purely to buff myself and went in for melee. Luckily, the buffs that scale with Inferno are very strong, so at no point did I feel underpowered, but I never really got to live out my spellcaster fantasy until the end game. Towards the end is when I finally got my hands on some really cool spells and a ring that allowed a slow trickle of mana regen. Combine that ring with one of the mana regen runes that you get for a shield, and suddenly you can go pure spellcaster. I wish they would have given the player a way to solve that issue earlier, or maybe a slow regen you get passively with the ring you get later on to boost that further. Another issue is some of the spells are very samey, like you get 3 different fireball spells, 1 small, 1 big, and a bouncing one. The Umbral spells suffer from this as well, with 3 or 4 of them looking pretty much the same, just doing different things. Then there's the balancing with some of these. To be clear, most of the spells felt pretty good, but a few were really inconsistent, such as the Infernal Hounds. Wow, wait, that actually only summoned 1. It's supposed to summon 3. When you summon them, they stand still and shoot a flamethrower towards the target for a couple of seconds, but the problem is they don't move with the target, so they only get a small amount of damage out before the enemy just walks out of it. It's a really awesome spell in theory, just kind of bad in practice. The other spell I have an issue with just so happens to also be my favorite one, Cataclysm. The reason I love this spell is because of the insane damage you can put out, but the issue seems to be the way it targets things. It's very common for the meteors to simply fly over the target's head or fall way short, and when it costs 1/6 of your mana, you feel it. Okay, on to the good stuff, starting with magic. Yeah, I know I just went on a little rant about the magic, but there's more to like than dislike. Even though the spell selection isn't huge, most of them feel pretty good to use. For a while, I was running with a full debuff build, using a combination of spells for buffing myself with higher defenses, increasing my physical damage, and adding poison damage to my melee attacks, while also debuffing the enemy by reducing their defenses and damage output. This carried me through the majority of the game. Later on, I moved into a full Infernal spellcaster build when I was able to solve the mana regen issue, and I plan on running this for my second playthrough. I haven't messed around too much with the Radiant spells, so I don't have much of an opinion on those just yet, but I have been on the receiving end in PvP, and all I have to say is if you're the guy who spams Briarstorm in PvP, then there's a special place in the Umbral realm just for you. Something else I think they nailed is being able to access all your spells at the same time rather than cycling through them to get to the one you need. This needs to be the standard for Souls-likes with magic going forward. From Software, I'm looking at you. Something else I think they did a great job with is the block and parry system. When you block, a portion of your health bar turns white. This white portion is called a wither. You can hit something to regain that withered health back. The same thing goes for when you land a perfect parry, but the amount of damage you take is significantly reduced while also allowing you to stagger your opponent. If you were to take a direct hit while having wither damage, you lose the chance to regain that health back by dealing damage. This system adds some flavor to combat rather than just roll spamming your way to victory, and reduces people's reliance on using shields while also adding some high risk, high reward gameplay. There are also stances in Lord of the Fallen. You could choose to one-hand or two-hand each weapon and switch between stances mid-combo, giving you some flexibility. I didn't really use this all too much since my dual axes melted through everything, but it was nice to have it as an option, especially if you're using a shield or a big heavy weapon. Speaking of weapons, there are a lot to choose from. Looking through the wiki, I counted about 180, not including shields or throwables like banners, darts, and grenades. You can also socket each weapon with up to 3 runes for extra effects like better scaling, more elemental or physical damage, health and mana regen, and a bunch of others, giving your build a little extra depth. You also have 2 ring slots and an amulet slot, but I think they could have done better with these. There are a few options here I thought were pretty cool, like a ring that makes it so when you apply poison, you also apply bleed, or another one that makes your burn also apply ignite. But beyond those, most of the options are very generic and don't really offer much more than a boost to a specific damage type or an increase to some stats. Something else I was a little disappointed with was the boss fights. Now, I wouldn't say they were bad, but most were pretty mid at best, with the exception of a few that I thought were really solid. The ending I got was very underwhelming though, but I'm hoping the other endings are a bit better. When I finished the game, I was streaming it in Discord for someone, and we both kind of had the same reaction, like, that's it. The last thing I want to touch on is the multiplayer. I've heard a lot of people saying good things about the multiplayer, being able to drop in and out whenever. It's true, you can go through the entire game with a friend, but only the host gets progress. So if I'm playing with a buddy for a few hours and decide to hop back into my own game, I have to redo all of that again. On top of that, if you join a friend, you won't be able to pick up any static loot like chests, weapons, and spells, among other things, while also getting much less experience. On the bright side, if you die in someone else's world, you won't drop all of your vigor, here, so you could play a little more risky, and the host has the ability to revive you at the cost of one of their healing items. Connection to the host was a little iffy as well. I tried playing with 2 different people with mixed results. It was playable, but still needs some work. PvP is where it felt like they didn't even try. Most of my attempts to invade are met with a disconnection, and the times I actually get to load into someone's game, it's so laggy that I can't even tell what's happening most of the time. I also had a few where the game puts me in an area the host hasn't even opened up yet, so I'm just stuck waiting for them to progress to that point. It's a bit of a bummer since PvP was something I was really looking forward to. To wrap things up, I would say this game isn't perfect, but I think the good outweighs the bad here, unless all you care about is PvP. The combat overall is polished and well done, with tons of weapons and armor sets to choose from, and progressing through each area was a lot of fun. My current score for this game is a 7.5. If they manage to fix the broken multiplayer, that score will go up. This is a great addition to the Souls-like genre and worth a playthrough if you really enjoy these types of games.